The Lord of the Rings is a series of 3 epic fantasy adventure films directed by Peter Jackson, based on the novel The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. The films are subtitled The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. Produced and distributed by New Line Cinema with the CO production of Wingnut Films, the series is an international venture between New Zealand and the United States. The films feature an ensemble cast including Elijah Wood, Ian McKellen, Liv Tyler, Viggo Mortensen, Sean Astin, Kate Blanchett, John Rhys-Davies, Christopher Lee, Billy Boyd, Dominic Monaghan, Orlando Bloom, Hugo Weaving, Andy Serkis and Sean Bean. Set in the fictional world of Middle-earth, the films follow the hobbit Frodo Baggins as he and the Fellowship embark on a quest to destroy the One Ring, to ensure the destruction of its maker, the Dark Lord Sauron. The Fellowship eventually splits up and Frodo continues the quest with his loyal companion Sam and the treacherous Gollum. Meanwhile, Aragorn, heir in exile to the throne of Gondor, along with Legolas, Gimli, Boromir, Merry, Pippin, and the wizard Gandalf, unite to save the free peoples of Middle-earth from the forces of Sauron and rally them in the War of the Ring to aid Frodo by distracting Sauron's attention. The 3 films were shot simultaneously and entirely in Jackson's native New Zealand from October 11, 1999 until December 22, 2000, with pickup shots done from 2001 to 2003. It was one of the biggest and most ambitious film projects ever undertaken, with a budget of $281 million. The first film in the series premiered at the Odeon Leicester Square in London on December 10, 2001, the second film premiered at the Ziegfeld Theatre in New York City on December 5, 2002, the third film premiered at the Embassy Theatre in Wellington on December 1, 2003. An extended edition of each film was released on home video a year after its release in cinemas. The Lord of the Rings is widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential film series ever made. It was a major financial success and is among the highest-grossing film series of all time with $2.991 billion in worldwide receipts. All 3 films received widespread acclaim from critics and audiences, who lauded the acting, direction, writing, production values, score, ambition, emotional depth, groundbreaking special effects and faithfulness to the source material. The series received numerous accolades, winning 17 Academy Awards out of 30 total nominations, including Best Picture for The Return of the King. In 2021, The Fellowship of the Ring was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Names. Etymology. Tolkien derived the name Gandalf from Gondalfr, a dwarf in the Voluspa est Vergatel, a list of dwarf names. In Old Norse, the name means staff elf. This is reflected in his name Tharkan, which is said to mean staff man in Husdol, one of Tolkien's invented languages. In universe names, Gandalf is given several names and nicknames in Tolkien's writings. Faramir calls him the Grey Pilgrim, and reports Gandalf as saying, "Many are my names in many countries." Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkan to the dwarves, Olorin I was in my youth in the west that is forgotten, in the south Incanus, in the north Gandalf, to the east I go not. In an early manuscript version of The Hobbit, he is called Blader Thin. The name Gandalf is used by the dwarf who later became Thorin Oakenshield. Each wizard is distinguished by the color of his cloak. For most of his manifestation as a wizard, Gandalf's cloak is grey, hence the names Gandalf the Grey and Greyhame, from Old English hame, cover, skin. Mithrandir is a name in Sindarin meaning the Grey Pilgrim or the Grey Wanderer. Midway through The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf becomes the head of the Order of Wizards, and is renamed Gandalf the White. This change in status introduces another name for the wizard, the White Rider. However, characters who speak Elvish still refer to him as Mithrandir. At times in The Lord of the Rings, other characters address Gandalf by insulting nicknames, Stormcrow, Lathspell, and Grey Fool. Characteristics. Tolkien describes Gandalf as the last of the wizards to appear in Middle-earth, one who seemed the least, less tall than the others, and in looks more aged, grey-haired and grey-clad, and leaning on a staff. Yet the elf Círdan who met him on arrival nevertheless considered him the greatest spirit and the wisest, and gave him the elven ring of power called Narya, the Ring of Fire, containing a red stone for his aid and comfort. Tolkien explicitly links Gandalf to the element fire later in the same essay. Warm and eager was his spirit, for he was the enemy of Sauron, opposing the fire that devours and wastes with the fire that kindles, and succors in wan hope and distress, but his joy, and his swift wrath, were veiled in garments grey as ash, so that only those that knew him well glimpsed the flame that was within. Merry he could be, and kindly to the young and simple, yet quick at times to sharp speech and the rebuking of folly, but he was not proud, and sought neither power nor praise. Mostly he journeyed tirelessly on foot, leaning on a staff, and so he was called among men of the north Gandalf the Elf of the Wand. For they deemed him to be of elven kind, since he would at times work wonders among them, loving especially the beauty of fire, and yet such marvels he wrought mostly for mirth and delight, and desired not that any should hold him in awe or take his counsels out of fear. Yet it is said that in the ending of the task for which he came he suffered greatly, and was slain, and being sent back from death for a brief while was clothed then in white, and became a radiant flame. Fictional biography. Valinor. In Valinor, Gandalf was called Olorin. He was one of the mayor of Valinor, specifically, one of the people of the Vala Manwi. He was said to be the wisest of the mayor. He was closely associated with two other Vala, Irmo, in whose gardens he lived, and Nienna, the patron of mercy, who gave him tutelage. When the Vala decided to send the Order of the Wizards across the Great Sea to Middle-earth to counsel and assist all those who opposed Sauron, Olorin was proposed by Manwë. Olorin initially begged to be excused, declaring he was too weak and that he feared Sauron, but Manwë replied that that was all the more reason for him to go. As one of the mayor, Gandalf was not a mortal man but an angelic being who had taken human form. As one of those spirits, Olorin was in service to the Creator and the Creator's secret fire. Along with the other mayor who entered into Middle-earth as the Five Wizards, he took on the specific form of an old man as a sign of his humility. The role of the wizards was to advise and counsel but never to attempt to match Sauron's strength with their own. It might be, too, that the kings and lords of Middle-earth would be more receptive to the advice of a humble old man than a more glorious form giving them direct commands. Middle-earth. The wizards arrived in Middle-earth separately. Early in the Third Age, Gandalf was the last, landing in the havens of Myth-London. He seemed the oldest and least in stature, but Círdan the shipwright felt that he was the greatest on their first meeting in the havens, and gave him Narya, the Ring of Fire. Saruman, the chief wizard, learned of the gift and resented it. Gandalf hid the ring well, and it was not widely known until he left with the other ring-bearers at the end of the Third Age that he, and not Círdan, was the holder of the third of the Elven Rings. Gandalf's relationship with Saruman, the head of their order, was strained. The wizards were commanded to aid men, elves, and dwarves, but only through counsel. They were forbidden to use force to dominate them, though Saruman increasingly disregarded this. The White Council. The Quest of Erebor. I the Hobbit / I. None. I the Lord of the Rings / I. None. Gandalf the Grey. Gandalf the White. Concept and creation. Appearance. Tolkien's biographer Humphrey Carpenter relates that Tolkien owned a postcard entitled Der Berggeist, which he labeled The Origin of Gandalf. It shows a white-bearded man in a large hat and cloak seated among boulders in a mountain forest. Carpenter said that Tolkien recalled buying the postcard during his holiday in Switzerland in 1911. Manfred Zimmermann, however, discovered that the painting was by the German artist Joseph Madlener and dates from the mid-1920s. Carpenter acknowledged that Tolkien was probably mistaken about the origin of the postcard. An additional influence may have been Vainamoinen, an old and wise demigod and the central character in Finnish folklore and the national epic Kalevala by Elias Lönnrot. Throughout the early drafts, and through to the first edition of The Hobbit, Bladurfin/Gandalf is described as being a little old man, distinct from a dwarf, but not of the full human stature that would later be described in The Lord of the Rings. Even in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf was not tall, shorter, for example, than Elrond or the other wizards. Name. When writing The Hobbit in the early 1930s, Tolkien gave the name Gandalf to the leader of the dwarves, the character later called Thorin Oakenshield. The name is taken from the same source as all the other dwarf names in The Hobbit, the Catalogue of Dwarves in the Völuspá. The Old Norse name Gondulfr incorporates the words Gandr meaning wand, staff, or magic and Alfr elf. The name Gandalf is found in at least one more place in Norse myth, in the semi-historical Heimskringla, which briefly describes Gandalf Alfgeirsson, a legendary Norse king from eastern Norway and rival of Halfdan the Black. Gandalf is also the name of a Norse sea king in Henrik Ibsen's second play, The Burial Mound. The name Gandalf occurs as a character in William Morris' 1896 fantasy novel The Well at the World's End, along with the horse Silverfax, adapted by Tolkien as Gandalf's horse Shadowfax. Morris' book, inspired by Norse myth, is set in a pseudo-medieval landscape. It deeply influenced Tolkien. The wizard that became Gandalf was originally named Bladurfin. Tolkien came to regret his ad hoc use of Old Norse names, referring to a rabble of Edik-named dwarves, invented in an idle hour in 1937. But the decision to use Old Norse names came to have far-reaching consequences in the composition of The Lord of the Rings. In 1942, Tolkien decided that the work was to be a purported translation from the fictional language of Westron, and in the English translation Old Norse names were taken to represent names in the language of Dale. Gandalf, in this setting, is thus a representation in English of the name the dwarves of Erebor had given to Ullrin in the language they used externally in their daily affairs, while Tharkin is the name, presumably of the same meaning, that the dwarves gave him in their native Husdul language. Guide. Gandalf's role and importance was substantially increased in the conception of The Lord of the Rings, and in a letter of 1954, Tolkien refers to Gandalf as an angel incarnate. In the same letter Tolkien states he was given the form of an old man in order to limit his powers on Earth. Both in 1965 and 1971 Tolkien again refers to Gandalf as an angelic being. In a 1946 letter, Tolkien stated that he thought of Gandalf as an Odinic wanderer. Other commentators have similarly compared Gandalf to the Norse god Odin in his wanderer guise, an old man with one eye, a long white beard, a wide-brimmed hat, and a staff, or likened him to Merlin of Arthurian legend or the Jungian archetype of the wise old man. The Tolkien scholar Charles W. Nelson described Gandalf as a guide who assists a major character on a journey or quest to unusual and distant places. He noted that in both The Fellowship of the Ring and The Hobbit, Tolkien presents Gandalf in these terms. Immediately after the Council of Elrond, Gandalf tells the Fellowship, "Someone said that intelligence would be needed in the party. He was right. I think I shall come with you." Nelson notes the similarity between this and Thorin's statement in The Hobbit. "We shall soon start on our long journey, a journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, may never return." Nelson gives as examples of the guide figure the Cumean Sibyl who assisted Aeneas on his journey through the underworld in Virgil's tale The Aeneid, and then Virgil himself in Dante's Inferno, directing, encouraging, and physically assisting Dante as he travels through hell. In English literature, Nelson notes, Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur has the wizard Merlin teaching and directing Arthur to begin his journeys. Given these precedents, Nelson remarks, it was unsurprising that Tolkien should make use of a guide figure, endowing him, like these predecessors, with power, wisdom, experience, and practical knowledge, and aware of own limitations and ranking in the order of the great. Other characters who act as wise and good guides include Tom Bombadil, Elrond, Aragorn, Galadriel, who he calls perhaps the most powerful of the guide figures, and briefly also Faramir. Nelson writes that there is equally historical precedent for wicked guides, such as Edmund Spenser's evil Palmers in The Faerie Queene, and suggests that Gollum functions as an evil guide, contrasted with Gandalf, in Lord of the Rings. He notes that both Gollum and Gandalf are servants of the One, Eru Ilúvatar, in the struggle against the forces of darkness, and ironically all of them, good and bad, are necessary to the success of the quest. He comments, too, that despite Gandalf's evident power, and the moment when he faces the Lord of the Nazgul, he stays in the role of guide throughout, never directly confront his enemies with his raw power. Christ figure. The critic N.C. Petty, writing about allegory in the J.R.R. Tolkien Encyclopedia, discusses Gandalf's death and reappearance in Christian terms. She cites Michael W. Marr, S.J., who could not think of Gandalf's descent into the pits of Moria and his return clothed in white as a death-resurrection motif. She at once notes, however, that such a narrow interpretation limits the reader's imagination by demanding a single meaning for each character and event. Other scholars and theologians have likened Gandalf's return as a gleaming white figure to the transfiguration of Christ. The philosopher Peter Kreeft, like Tolkien a Roman Catholic, observes that there is no one complete, concrete, visible Christ figure in the Lord of the Rings comparable to Aslan in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series. However, Kreeft and Jean Chose have identified reflections of the figure of Jesus Christ in three protagonists of the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf, Frodo, and Aragorn. While Chose found facets of the personality of Jesus in them, Kreeft wrote that they exemplify the Old Testament threefold messianic symbolism of prophet, priest, and king. Adaptations. In the BBC radio dramatisations, Gandalf has been voiced by Norman Shelley in The Lord of the Rings, Heron Carvick in The Hobbit, Bernard Mays in The Lord of the Rings, and Sir Michael Hordern in The Lord of the Rings. John Huston voiced Gandalf in the animated films The Hobbit and The Return of the King produced by Rankin/Bass. William Squire voiced Gandalf in the animated film The Lord of the Rings directed by Ralph Bakshi. Ivan Ikrasco played Gandalf in the Soviet film adaptation The Hobbit. Gandalf was portrayed by Vesa Viorico in the Finnish television miniseries Hobbitite. Ian McKellen portrayed Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings film series, directed by Peter Jackson, after Sean Connery and Patrick Stewart both turned down the role. According to Jackson, McKellen based his performance as Gandalf on Tolkien himself. We listened to audio recordings of Tolkien reading excerpts from Lord of the Rings. We watched some BBC interviews with him. There's a few interviews with Tolkien, and Ian based his performance on an impersonation of Tolkien. He's literally basing Gandalf on Tolkien. He sounds the same, he uses the speech patterns, and his mannerisms are born out of the same roughness from the footage of Tolkien. So, Tolkien would recognize himself in Ian's performance. McKellen received widespread acclaim for his portrayal of Gandalf, particularly in The Fellowship of the Ring, for which he received a Screen Actors Guild Award and an Academy Award nomination, both for Best Supporting Actor. Empire named Gandalf, as portrayed by McKellen, the 30th greatest film character of all time. He reprised the role in the Hobbit film series, claiming that he enjoyed playing Gandalf the Grey more than Gandalf the White. He voiced Gandalf for several video games based on the films, including The Two Towers, The Return of the King, and The Third Age. Charles Picard portrayed Gandalf in the 1999 stage production of The Two Towers at Chicago's Lifeline Theatre. Brent Carver portrayed Gandalf in the 2006 musical production The Lord of the Rings, which opened in Toronto. Gandalf appears in the Lego Movie, voiced by Todd Hanson. Gandalf is a main character in the video game LEGO Dimensions and is voiced by Tom Kane. Gandalf has his own movement in Johann Damage Symphony No. 1 The Lord of the Rings, which was written for concert band and premiered in 1988. See also: Secret Fire, Vainamainen, main character in the Finnish national epic Kalevala. Notes.